Marcus had always felt most alive when he was outdoors. Long before dawn, he would lace up his boots, sling his rifle over his shoulder, and step into the quiet stillness of the woods. Hunting wasn't just a hobby for him, it was a tradition, a way to connect with the land and escape the stress of his everyday life. He hunted responsibly, always within the limits of his own property, respecting both nature and the law. That morning had been no different. After hours of patient waiting, he returned home with a modest prize, feeling the familiar satisfaction of a day well spent. But his good mood didn't last long. Pinned to his front door was an envelope with the HOA's logo printed boldly at the top. Curious, Marcus tore it open, only to feel his chest tighten as he read the letter inside. They were fining him hundreds of dollars for hunting within community boundaries, claiming his activity violated their neighborhood rules. Marcus frowned in disbelief. He hadn't set a single foot on their land. Every step he took had been on his own property. At first, he thought it must be some kind of mistake. Surely, if he explained, the board would understand. But as he read the words again, he realized it wasn't about rules at all. It was about control. They wanted to remind him that no matter what he did, they believed they had authority over him. The fine wasn't just money, it was a message. Marcus stood there on his porch, the letter crumpling in his fist. He had worked hard for his home, his land, and his freedom. And now, in a single piece of paper, the HOA was trying to strip that away. What they didn't know was that Marcus wasn't the kind of man to back down. Marcus decided to face the situation head-on. He showed up at the next HOA meeting, a folder of property maps and hunting regulations tucked neatly under his arm. The clubhouse was crowded, filled with neatly dressed board members sitting around a long polished table, their eyes cool and dismissive as he entered. Marcus laid out his evidence clearly and calmly. He pointed to the maps, showed them the boundaries, and explained that every step he had taken was on his own land, well within legal rights. "I followed the law," he said firmly. "This fine has no grounds." But instead of listening, they leaned back in their chairs with smug expressions. One man, adjusting his gold watch, gave a laugh that felt more like a sneer. "Rules are rules," he said, "and people like you need to understand that this is a community, not the wild." The room chuckled softly, and though no one said it outright, Marcus caught the undertone in their words, the same quiet prejudice he had felt too many times before. They weren't interested in fairness. They weren't interested in facts. They wanted to put him in his place. The board voted quickly, almost mockingly, and confirmed the fine without hesitation. To them, it was just another routine decision, another show of authority. But to Marcus, it was a line they had just crossed. He walked out of that clubhouse with his jaw tight, his pride stinging, and his anger simmering like a fire waiting for fuel. As the night settled around him, Marcus made a silent promise to himself. They thought they had the power, that he was just one man against their whole community board, but they had underestimated him. And soon, they would learn just how big of a mistake that was. For weeks after that meeting, Marcus kept to himself, but behind the scenes he was quietly moving pieces into place. While the HOA members boasted about their victory, he was sitting across from real estate agents, studying contracts, and making calls late into the night. He had always saved carefully, building a quiet reserve of money from years of hard work. That savings, once meant for future projects, now had a new purpose. Marcus had discovered something the HOA didn't know. The sprawling forest land where the community's beloved hiking trails wound through the trees wasn't actually owned by the HOA at all. It belonged to an aging farmer who had been looking to sell. When Marcus met the man, the deal felt almost fated. The farmer, tired of maintaining the property, was more than willing to sell it to someone who truly respected the land. Marcus signed the papers without hesitation, every stroke of the pen sealing his plan. He knew the price was steep, but the satisfaction of reclaiming power was worth every dollar. A month later, the news swept through the neighborhood like wildfire. The land, the pride of the community, the place where families walked every weekend, where children ran through trails and couples hiked at sunset, was no longer theirs to use. The new owner was Marcus, the same man they had fined and mocked. Neighbors gathered in disbelief, some refusing to believe it was true. But Marcus had the title deed in his hands, and there was no denying it. For the first time since the HOA had tried to put him down, Marcus felt the weight lift off his shoulders. They thought they had control, but now, the balance of power had shifted entirely into his hands. The very next morning, bright new signs appeared at the entrances of the trails. In bold red letters, they read, "Private property, no Marcus had paid for professional posts, sturdy enough that no one could claim they were temporary or a mistake. The once busy paths where neighbors jogged and children played were now sealed off with heavy chains and warning signs. For the first time in years, the forest stood quiet. It didn't take long for outrage to spread. Within hours, angry knocks rattled Marcus's front door. Neighbors crowded on his porch, shouting that the land belonged to the community, that their children needed the trails, that he was being unfair. Some tried to guilt him, others demanded he be reasonable. But Marcus stood calmly, his arms crossed, and listened to them vent. When they finally paused, he answered with the same calmness they had mocked weeks earlier. "You fined me for using my own property," he said evenly. "Now you know what it feels like to lose something you thought you controlled." His words were sharp, but his tone never rose. That quiet strength made his message even harder to ignore. The HOA board called emergency meetings, scrambling to find loopholes, desperate to reclaim what they had lost. But every document, every map, every deed confirmed the same truth. The land was his, fair and legal. No one could touch it unless Marcus allowed it. Days passed, and the once lively trails grew overgrown. Families who once filled the woods with laughter now sat at home, bitter and frustrated. The silence of the forest became a daily reminder that arrogance has consequences. Marcus hadn't broken any laws, hadn't raised his voice, and yet he had taught the HOA a lesson they would never forget. Weeks turned into months, and the reality of what had happened finally began to sink in for the community. The once vibrant trails, once their pride and joy, were now silent and closed off. What had been a gathering place filled with laughter and fresh air became a stretch of land no one dared enter. Parents complained their children no longer had a safe place to play. Joggers had to run along crowded streets. And families who once boasted about their neighborhood now whispered bitterly about the loss. The HOA, once so confident in its authority, faced a storm of angry residents demanding answers. But there was nothing they could do. Marcus owned the land, and the decision was final. Marcus, however, wasn't boastful. He didn't gloat, didn't shout, and never rubbed it in their faces. He simply lived his life, quietly reminding everyone that respect is earned, not forced. Whenever neighbors confronted him, demanding he reopen the trails, Marcus would calmly repeat the same words. "You tried to take away my rights. Now you've lost something of your own." His steady tone cut deeper than any anger ever could. Over time, people began to realize the weight of what had happened. The fine they had once laughed about, the arrogance of dismissing his voice, had cost them something far greater. Marcus had shown them that one man, with patience and determination, could stand against an entire system and win without breaking a single rule. And so, the neighborhood learned a painful but lasting lesson. Power used unfairly will always come back to haunt you. Marcus had taken back his dignity, his respect, and his place in the community. And with every step he took on his own land, he walked with a quiet strength that no HOA could ever take away. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, comment, and share your thoughts. Subscribe to The Silent Side USA for more powerful stories every week.